By 9, the restaurant had thinned out to the regulars and the stragglers. And carried the tray low against her hip the way she always did, weight distributed so her wrist wouldn't ache by close, and set it down on the service station to check the ticket one more time before she walked it out. Table 11. Same as always. He sat where he always sat, back to the wall, a clean sight line to both the front door and the kitchen pass, his suit jacket still buttoned even though he'd been sitting there for 20 minutes. Duck-hwan. She didn't know his name yet, not really. Mr. Kim had said it once, low like it cost him something to say it out loud, just serve him and don't linger, but she'd catalogued him the way she catalogued everything. Precise. Economical. A man who left exact payment and one folded bill and never looked at her long enough for her to catch the color of his eyes. Tonight she set the galbi gym in front of him without a word, the way she always did, and turned to go. She almost made it 2 steps. The pause was what got her attention first. Not the chopsticks moving, but the chopsticks not moving, hovering an inch above the short rib like his hand had forgotten what it was for. She turned back out of habit, the same reflex that made her check on any table that went quiet too long, and that was when she saw it. His shoulders had dropped. Not slumped, dropped, like something that had been holding them up for a long time had simply let go, vertebra by vertebra, and underneath the tailored jacket she could see the shape of a much younger man, a man who had maybe once sat at a smaller table with his knees not quite reaching the floor. His jaw worked once, twice, a muscle jumping at the hinge like he was chewing on something that wasn't food. And his eyes, she was close enough now to see them, and they weren't cold anymore, weren't doing the flat, unreadable thing they always did. They had cracked down the middle like lake ice does in March, silent, without warning, one long fracture running from corner to corner. He set the chopsticks down. Carefully. Like they were the only thing in the room he could still control. And didn't move. She had spent 6 years in restaurants learning when to disappear and when a person needed, more than anything, for someone to simply witness them without commentary. This was the second kind. So she stood there, tray forgotten against her hip, and watched a man built like a fortress take his elbow off the table and press 2 fingers hard against the bridge of his nose, breathing through it, breathing through whatever the smoked paprika and the extra 10 minutes of braise and the brown sugar had unlocked in him. Nobody else in the dining room noticed. The couple at table 9 were still deciding on dessert. A busser cleared glasses 3 tables over, oblivious. It was just the 2 of them in the middle of a crowded room, in a silence that had weight to it, the specific weight of a door opening onto a room that had been locked a long time. He didn't cry. Not really. It was smaller than that and somehow larger. A wet shine at the rims of his eyes that he blinked back before it could become anything a stranger might name, a swallow that traveled visibly down his throat, his free hand flat on the table like he needed the wood to be real. Then after a long moment he picked the chopsticks back up and ate. Slowly. Like a man rationing something he was afraid would disappear if he moved too fast. And walked back to the service station and stood there with her hand on the edge of the counter until it stopped feeling necessary to hold on to something. She had cooked from memory before. She had adjusted dishes the way her mother taught her without ever calling it teaching. A pinch more of this, a longer rest before serving, some quiet arithmetic of care that never announced itself as care. She had done it 100 times for people who never noticed, who ate and paid and left and never once looked up from their phones. She had done it for Duck-hwan on a whim, a Tuesday impulse she couldn't fully explain even to herself, because something about the tired set of his mouth every time he ordered the same thing had made her want to see if she could reach whatever was underneath it. She had reached it. She understood that now, standing at the station with her pulse still a little too fast. She had reached a place in this man that maybe nobody had touched in 20 years, and she had done it with braised short rib and a spoonful of brown sugar and the ghost of her mother's hands moving through her own. Table 11 didn't look up again. But something in the room had shifted anyway, the air pressure of it, the way a house changes when a door that's been shut for years finally swings open an inch. And picked her tray back up because there were other tables, because the rain was still coming down outside, because life didn't stop for the moment just because the moment mattered. But she carried it with her anyway, folded into the pocket of her apron alongside the pen and the crumpled backup order pad, small and heavy and entirely hers. Neither of them said a word. Neither of them needed to. Both of them knew, in the particular silence that follows something irreversible, that whatever this was, it had already started, and there was no version of the night that put it back. If you're watching this from your own kitchen table tonight or scrolling through or a break between shifts, tell me where you're watching from. And Marshall grew up on the south side of Chicago in a two-bedroom apartment above a currency exchange, in a building where the radiators clanked all winter and the hot water ran out by 7 most mornings, which meant if you wanted a real shower you got up before your brothers. She was the oldest of 4. Marcus, then the twins, Dre and Tay, for years behind her and inseparable in the way only twins are. And for the first 18 years of her life the household ran on her mother's cooking and her mother's discipline and a version of stability that Anne only understood in retrospect had been assembled out of overtime shifts and layaway and a stubborn refusal to let her children go without knowing they were loved, even when there wasn't much else to give them. Her mother, Denise, worked at a hospital laundry service, folding sheets for 11 hours a day, and came home smelling like industrial bleach and cooked anyway every night because she believed, and said so more than once standing at the stove with her back to the room, that a family that didn't eat together at a real table stopped being a family and started being roommates. Denise cooked the way some people prayed, with total attention, a kind of devotion that didn't need witnesses. She doctored boxed mac and cheese until it tasted like something from a real kitchen. She could make a chicken stretch 4 ways across a week and never once let it taste like leftovers. She had a habit, and would only understand years later that this was a habit, a philosophy, not an accident, of tasting everything twice before she plated it, adjusting at the very last second, a pinch of sugar to round off something too sharp, an extra clove of garlic mashed in with the back of a spoon, small corrections that nobody at the table could name but that everybody felt. And was 14 the first time her mother let her cook dinner alone. She remembers it specifically because she'd burned the cornbread and cried about it in the bathroom, and her mother knocked once and said through the door not unkindly, "Burnt bread still feeds people, baby, don't waste the tears on it," and then ate 2 pieces at dinner like they were the best thing she'd had all week. She was 18 when her mother had the stroke. It happened on a Tuesday in the kitchen mid-sentence, Denise's hand still on the edge of the counter when she went down, and Anne was the one who found her because she'd come home early from her shift at the diner to grab her uniform for the next day. She remembers the paramedics. She remembers the particular fluorescent hum of the hospital hallway at 2 in the morning. She remembers, more than anything, the moment a doctor she'd never met before said the word irreversible in a tone that suggested he'd said it enough times that it no longer cost him anything, and she understood, standing there in her diner uniform with ketchup on the cuff, that her life had just been rewritten without her input. She was 18. Marcus was 15. The twins were 14. There was no other adult in a position to step in. Her father had been gone since she was 6, an absence so total it barely qualified as a wound anymore, more like a scar she didn't think about until someone asked, and did what she had watched her mother do for 18 years. She got up and she made it work. She dropped out of community college after 1 semester. She picked up a second job at a Korean barbecue place in a strip mall off 87th, not because she knew anything about the food but because they were hiring and the hours worked around the diner shift, and something about the kitchen, the hiss of meat on the grill, the specific choreography of a busy service, settled something in her that she didn't examine too closely at the time. She learned to stretch a paycheck the way her mother had. She learned which bills could wait a week and which couldn't. She learned to cook for 4 teenagers on a budget that would have made a stranger's eyes widen, learned the particular exhaustion of coming home at 11 and still needing to check homework, sign permission slips, iron a shirt for a school picture day she'd almost forgotten. She was not bitter about it. That surprised people when they found out the shape of her 20s, the lack of bitterness. She didn't perform gratitude either. It simply was what it was. Her mother had died and someone had to hold the family together and she was the oldest and so it was her. She got the twins through high school. She got Marcus through a rough stretch at 17 that she still didn't talk about with anyone, not really, a stretch involving a boy he ran with and a gun that thankfully never got used, a stretch that ended with and sitting up until 4 in the morning waiting for him to come home and then not yelling, just holding him, both of them crying in the kitchen where their mother used to stand. By 23, the twins were in community college on financial aid and had spent a full year assembling paperwork for, and Marcus had a job at a warehouse that paid better than anything and had ever made, and the apartment above the currency exchange had a little more breathing room in it. That was when she left the strip mall Korean barbecue place. She'd worked her way up to shift lead there over 4 years, had learned more about food than she ever expected to, the specific alchemy of marinade and rest time and heat, and took a job downtown at a restaurant called Interracial, upscale, white tablecloth, the kind of place where a Tuesday dinner check could run higher than she used to make in a week. She was good at it immediately. Not flashy good. She didn't do the performative warmth some servers did, the theatrical friendliness that customers sometimes mistook for genuine care. She was good the way a person is good at something they'd been training for their whole life without knowing it. She noticed things. She noticed which tables wanted to be left alone and which wanted conversation. She noticed the man on a first date whose hands shook slightly when he reached for the water glass, and refilled it without commentary, giving him a small mercy he never had to ask for. She noticed the head chef, Mr. Kim, watching her the first month with a kind of wary respect, the look of a man deciding whether someone was serious or just passing through. She was serious. Food had never been casual to her. It was the one language her family had always spoken fluently even when everything else was falling apart, and she carried that into Isul's dining room without ever announcing it, plating and clearing and refilling with the quiet, contained competence of someone who had learned, a long time ago, that the loudest people in a room usually weren't the ones actually holding it together. She first noticed Duck-hwan on a Thursday in October, 3 months into the job. He came in alone, ordered the galbijim without opening the menu, sat with his back to the wall in a way that seemed less like preference and more like law, and ate in near total silence, his eyes tracking the door every time it opened. He left exact payment, folded a single bill on top of the check presenter. Not for her, she understood after the third time, some private ritual that had nothing to do with tipping, and was gone before she'd even finished clearing the next table. Mr. Kim caught her watching him once from the kitchen pass and said only low enough that no one else could hear. "That one you serve fast and you don't ask questions. You understand?" She understood. Or thought she did. She had grown up around men whose stillness meant something, whose silence was a form of armor built out of necessity rather than temperament, and she recognized the shape of that in him even from a distance. Recognized it the way you recognize a language you don't speak but have heard your whole life. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know what he did, not specifically, though the careful way the staff treated him told her enough. What she knew was smaller and more immediate. He ordered the same dish every single time and never finished more than half of it, and something about that, the waste of it, the specific tragedy of a man paying full price for food he couldn't bring himself to actually eat, snagged in her the way unfinished plates always did, a small persistent itch she didn't yet have a name for. She didn't say anything to him. Not that first month, not the second. She simply watched, the way she'd learned to watch everything that mattered, filing away small details without knowing yet what she'd do with them, the exact way he held his chopsticks, the 2 seconds he paused before every first bite like he was bracing for something, the fact that despite the expensive suit and the folded extra bill, he ate like a man who had once been hungry in a way that had nothing to do with money. She didn't know yet that she was already starting to solve a puzzle no one had asked her to solve. She just knew that some part of her, the part that had spent 8 years cooking for people who needed more than food, had already started paying attention. By December, Duck-hwan had become a fixture solid enough that the kitchen scheduled around him without discussing it out loud. Mr. Kim would glance at the reservation book on the nights he was expected and make sure the galbijim base was started early, made sure table 11 was clear. And had taken over his table without anyone formally assigning it to her. It had simply drifted her way after the third or fourth visit, the way certain regulars gravitate toward the server who reads them correctly, and she'd absorbed it into her rotation without comment. She noticed things accumulating. The unfinished plates, always at least a third left, sometimes more, the meat gone cold and glistening in its own sauce by the time she cleared it. The particular tension that lived permanently between his shoulder blades, visible even through the jacket, a tightness that never once, in 2 months of watching, fully released. He answered questions about the food in single words, fine mostly, sometimes nothing at all, just a small nod, and she'd learned not to push past that, understanding instinctively that pushing would only make him retreat further into the careful blankness he wore like a second suit. She asked Mr. Kim about the galbijim recipe on a slow Sunday afternoon, ostensibly out of general interest, though even as she asked she knew it wasn't general at all. Mr. Kim looked at her for a long moment before answering, the kind of look that suggested he understood exactly what she was really asking, and then walked her through it anyway, the specific ratio of soy to mirin, the aromatics, the low, patient braise that took the short rib from tough to falling apart tender over nearly 3 hours. "Everyone makes it a little different," he said, stirring a test batch, not looking at her. "My mother's version had more sugar than mine. My grandmother's had more sesame. You cook what your hands remember, not what the recipe says." That sentence stayed with her longer than she expected it to. She started experimenting at home on her 1 weeknight off, in the small kitchen of the apartment she now shared with just herself. The twins gone to their own place 2 years back, Marcus married and out east, buying short ribs from the Korean grocery 3 blocks over and running variations late into the night with the patience of someone solving a problem that mattered more than she was willing to admit out loud. She added smoked paprika on the 4th attempt, a 1/4 teaspoon, barely enough to register as a deliberate choice rather than an accident, and something about the smoke of it, layered under the soy and garlic, reminded her so sharply of her mother's oxtail, the kind Denise only made on birthdays, the kind that used a spoonful of brown sugar to round off the vinegar's edge, that she had to sit down at her own kitchen table for a minute, spoon still in hand, missing her mother. In a way that came less often now but hit just as hard when it did. She added the brown sugar next. Not much. A tablespoon dissolved slow into the braising liquid, just enough to soften the soy's sharpness into something rounder, something that tasted less like a restaurant dish and more like a kitchen you'd grown up eating in. She made it 4 more times before she trusted it. She didn't tell Mr. Kim what she was doing. She didn't fully understand what she was doing herself, only that some instinct she'd inherited and never examined too closely was steering her hands, the same instinct that used to tell her exactly how much salt a nervous 15-year-old boy's dinner needed on the night she found out he'd been running with a bad crowd. The night she finally served it to Duck-hwan, it was raining, the kind of steady October into November rain that turned the whole city gray and close. She'd made a small private decision earlier that afternoon, standing in the kitchen watching the base simmer, and by the time his reservation came in at 8:15 she had already decided. Tonight, table 11 gets the version from her own stove, not the restaurant standard. She told Mr. Kim only that she wanted to run a small variation past a long-time regular, and he'd studied her for a beat and then simply nodded, an unspoken understanding passing between them that this was something she needed to do rather than something she was asking permission for. She carried the plate out herself. Set it down without a word the way she always did. What happened after that she would replay for months. The pause of his chopsticks an inch above the meat, the exact moment his shoulders dropped like a held breath finally released, the crack that opened behind his eyes with no warning and no sound. She had cooked for grief before without knowing it, had adjusted dishes instinctively for people whose sadness she'd clocked without being told, but she had never watched it land quite like this, never watched a stranger's face come apart so completely and so silently in the middle of a crowded room. She stood there longer than professional distance technically allowed, tray forgotten against her hip, watching him press 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and breathe through something that clearly went back further than tonight, further than this restaurant, maybe further than she'd ever be told. When he finally picked the chopsticks back up and started eating again, slow, deliberate, like a man trying to make something last, she made herself turn and walk back to the service station, because staying would have turned witnessing into intrusion, and she understood the difference even if she couldn't have explained it out loud. She didn't tell anyone what she'd seen. Not Mr. Kim, not the other servers, not even herself in so many words. She simply understood, standing at that station with her heart going a little too fast, that something had happened that she couldn't take back, and that whatever came next, she didn't know what would come next, had no framework for what came next, was already set in motion, the way water finds the crack in a foundation and doesn't stop just because nobody invited it in. He came back the following Thursday, same time, same table, and when and approached with her pad he said before she could ask, the same as last time, and something in the specificity of it, not the Galby Jim but the same as last time, told her he knew exactly what had been different, even if neither of them was going to say so out loud. She started making the modified version his standard order without discussion, an understanding that passed between them entirely through food rather than words. He still ate in near silence. He still tracked the door. But something had shifted in the quality of his silence, subtle enough that she doubted anyone else at ISOL would have noticed it. A fraction less tension in the set of his jaw, a nod when she cleared his plate instead of nothing at all, once, memorably, something that might have technically qualified as eye contact lasting a full 2 seconds before he looked away. She kept it to herself. Not out of shame exactly, but out of the same instinct that had always made her guard the things that mattered. A habit built from years of understanding that the world took liberties with what you shared freely, that some things stayed safer and truer if you didn't hand them over to be discussed, dissected, made smaller by other people's opinions. She didn't mention it to the other servers when they gossiped about the mysterious silent man at 11. She didn't mention it to Mr. Kim beyond the one quiet exchange about ratios. It lived in her privately, a small locked room she visited alone. The younger man appeared in late November, on a night Duck-hwan came in slightly later than usual, trailing him by 2 minutes and taking a table near the front that gave him a clear view of table 11 without ever ordering more than a beer he barely touched. And clocked him the way she clocked everything, the restlessness in his knee bouncing under the table, the way his eyes kept cutting toward Duck-hwan and then away, performing casualness badly. She'd grown up around enough young men carrying tension like a loaded thing to recognize the particular energy of someone watching another person the way you watch prey or a threat or both. Duck-hwan clocked him too. She saw it in the almost imperceptible way his posture recalibrated, shoulders squaring a half-inch, hand shifting slightly closer to the edge of the table. He said nothing. He finished his meal at the same unhurried pace as always, left the same exact payment and the same folded bill, and walked out into the cold without once looking directly at the younger man's table, though she understood, watching it, that he had clocked every second of it without appearing to. She didn't ask questions. Mr. Kim's warning from months earlier sat in her the way most warnings from people who knew more than she did tended to sit, respected, not litigated. But she found herself, that night and several after, running the calculus of what she actually knew about the man she'd started cooking for. That he was dangerous in some capacity she couldn't fully name. That people watched him the way you watch something you're afraid of or answerable to. That underneath all of it was a grief specific enough that a single dish could crack him open in front of a room full of strangers. She sat with the contradiction of it on her nights off, in the quiet of her apartment, turning it over the way she used to turn over problems that didn't have clean answers. How to make rent stretch, how to get Marcus through a bad year without losing him, how to hold a family together on nothing but will and a decent recipe for stretching a chicken. This felt like that. Not dangerous in the same way but structurally similar. A situation with no easy resolution that she'd nonetheless already stepped into, whether she'd meant to or not. She thought about pulling back. She was honest enough with herself to consider it seriously. One slow Tuesday afternoon before the dinner rush, standing in the walk-in with her arms crossed against the cold, running through the practical argument the way she'd run through practical arguments her whole adult life. She didn't know this man, didn't know what he did or who watched him or why, and she had spent her entire 20s building a version of herself that didn't need anyone, didn't lean, didn't risk the kind of vulnerability that came from letting someone else matter. Self-containment wasn't a personality quirk for her. It was infrastructure. It was the thing that had kept 4 people fed and housed and mostly whole after their mother died with no warning at a kitchen counter on a Tuesday. But she thought too, standing there, about the specific weight of watching someone come apart over something she'd made with her own hands, about the strange privilege of having reached a place in a stranger that apparently no one else had reached in years. She thought about her mother's hands moving through hers, about the particular ache of legacy, about the fact that some kinds of care couldn't be undone once they'd been offered, whether or not the offering had been wise. She stayed. She didn't decide to stay, exactly. There was no clean moment of resolution, no single decisive thought. She simply kept showing up on the nights he came in, kept making the dish the way she'd made it that first rainy night, kept holding the small locked room of what she'd witnessed without opening it to anyone else. By the time she admitted to herself, weeks later, walking home in the cold with her coat collar up against the wind, that she was already involved in something larger than a customer relationship, it didn't feel like a revelation. It felt like catching up to a fact that had been true for a while. She hadn't planned this. She wasn't the kind of woman who went looking for complicated men or unnecessary risk. She'd had enough of both, secondhand, watching her brother's teenage years unfold in real time. But she understood, walking home that night, that plans and reality had a way of diverging, and that she was already several steps down a path she hadn't consciously chosen, carried there by nothing more dramatic than a plate of food and the simple, stubborn fact of paying attention to another human being's hunger. Winter set in hard by January, the kind of Chicago cold that made the walk from the L stop feel like a small daily punishment, and through it Duck-hwan's visits held steady, Thursdays mostly, occasionally a second night midweek when something in his schedule shifted. And had stopped thinking of the modified Galbi gym as an experiment and started thinking of it, quietly, as a dish that existed now specifically because of him, shaped around a grief she still knew almost nothing about except its outline. The interactions between them stayed limited in scope but grew heavier in weight, the way a held silence between 2 people can accumulate meaning the way a held silence between strangers never does. He started making small adjustments to his order, an extra side of rice, once unprompted, which she understood without being told meant he intended to actually finish the meal that night. He nodded to her now when she approached, not just when she cleared. Twice she caught him watching her work a different table with an attention that had nothing to do with the food, something more like simple curiosity, and both times he looked away the instant she noticed, embarrassed in a way that seemed almost foreign to the controlled version of him she'd catalogued for months. The first time he spoke to her beyond ordering came on a Thursday in late January, snow coming down thick outside the windows, the dining room half empty because of the weather. She'd set the plate down and started to turn away when he said, quietly, not quite meeting her eyes, "You changed something. In the sauce." It wasn't a question, not exactly, but she understood it was asking for confirmation anyway. She could have deflected, could have said something vague about the kitchen, about seasonal variation, the kind of harmless non-answer she'd have given any other regular curious about a recipe. Instead she found herself telling him the truth, or a careful piece of it. "Smoked paprika," she said. "And a little brown sugar. My mother used to do something similar with oxtail." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she almost apologized for oversharing, for making it strange. Then he said, so low she almost missed it under the sound of the kitchen behind her, "My mother made something like this. A long time ago. That was all." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask him to, understanding instinctively that the sentence had cost him something significant just to say out loud, that pushing for more would be its own kind of violence. She simply nodded, said something small and unremarkable about hoping he enjoyed the meal, and walked away carrying the exchange like something breakable in her hands. The watching men returned twice that month, different faces but the same restless energy, the same badly performed casualness, and both times Duck-hwan's posture recalibrated in that same subtle way, a fraction more alert, a fraction closer to the door. Once, one of them approached the host's stand and asked, with false politeness, whether Duck-hwan was expected that evening, and Anne, who happened to be near enough to overhear, felt something cold and instinctive move through her, a recognition of danger dressed up as small talk, the exact texture of trouble she'd learned to identify young, growing up in a neighborhood where trouble rarely announced itself honestly. She said nothing to the host, who handled it with practiced neutrality, offering no information. But she found herself, that night, watching the door a little more carefully than usual, understanding without being told that her attention to Duck-hwan's safety had become, without her fully consenting to it, part of the shape of her job. The note came on the last Thursday of the month, tucked under the folded bill he always left, small enough that she almost missed it while clearing the table. 2 words, written in a tight, careful hand that suggested someone unused to writing much of anything by hand at all. "Thank you." She stood at the service station holding it longer than she needed to, turning it over once, twice, the paper thin and slightly damp from the rain that had started up again outside. She thought about the specific improbability of it. A man who by every visible sign trusted no one, who moved through the world with the guarded precision of someone who had learned trust was a liability, had nonetheless sat down and written 2 words and left them for her, deliberately, knowing she'd find them. She folded the note and put it in the pocket of her apron, and later, at home, transferred it carefully into the drawer of her nightstand where she kept the few things that mattered enough to keep. A photo of her mother, a birthday card from Marcus written the year he'd finally gotten his life on track, a pressed flower from the twins' college graduation. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time that night, the note in her lap, feeling the specific vertigo of understanding that something in her carefully built, carefully self-contained life had shifted, quietly and without her permission, into something she no longer fully controlled. She had spent 8 years building a life that required nothing from anyone, a life where she gave care freely because she chose to and never because she needed anything back. This felt different. This felt like the beginning of needing something back, even if she couldn't yet name what that something was, and the recognition of it sat uneasily alongside the small, undeniable warmth the note had put in her chest. 2 competing truths she didn't try to resolve that night, just sat with, the way she'd learned to sit with most of the hard things life handed her, without flinching and without pretending they didn't weigh what they weighed. February brought a Thursday cold enough that the restaurant's radiators worked overtime and the windows fogged at the edges, and it was on that night, close to closing, the dining room down to just his table and one other, that Duck-hwan did something he had never done in 4 months of visits. He gestured briefly to the empty seat across from him and said, "Sit. You have a minute?" She glanced toward the kitchen. Mr. Kim was visible through the pass, and something in his face when he clocked the gesture suggested he'd half expected this, or at least wasn't surprised by it, and then she sat carefully on the edge of the chair, still half in server mode, pad in her apron pocket like a habit she couldn't fully set down. "Duck-hwan," he said before she could ask. "My name." And she said back, though she suspected he already knew it, had probably known it for weeks from the small brass name tag she wore, and offering it anyway felt like its own kind of exchange, a formality neither of them needed but both of them wanted. He was quiet for a moment, turning his water glass a quarter turn on the tablecloth, and then he told her, in sentences so sparse they felt rationed, about his mother's kitchen. A small apartment in Incheon, a woman who cooked the way Anne's mother had, instinctively, without measuring, adjusting a dish at the last second based on nothing but memory and taste. He didn't say much about what had happened to that kitchen or to her, only that he hadn't been able to enter a kitchen, any kitchen, for himself in over 20 years, that the smell of certain things cooking still did something to his chest that he'd spent 2 decades learning to suppress in public. This dish, he said, not looking at her, it took me back there. The first time. I did not expect that. She told him pieces of her own history in return, careful, unperformed, not the whole shape of it, not yet, but enough. Her mother. The stroke. The particular weight of becoming responsible for 3 younger siblings at 18 with no warning and no manual. She told him about learning to cook out of necessity rather than passion at first, and how somewhere in the middle of all those years of stretching food and stretching patience, it had become something closer to love, a language she spoke fluently because it was the only one that had never let her down. He listened the way she suspected he did, everything, completely, without the distracted half-attention most people offered, his eyes on her the whole time in a way that would have felt invasive from anyone else and instead felt, from him, like the rarest kind of respect. You did not have a childhood, he said, when she'd finished, not unkindly, more like an observation he'd arrived at slowly. I had one, she said. It just ended early. He nodded at that, like the distinction mattered to him, like he understood exactly the difference between a childhood that never existed and one that had simply been cut short because his own, she suspected, had been cut short in its own way, not by death necessarily but by something that had asked too much of him too young, that had taught him the specific arithmetic of trust and betrayal before he was old enough to have a say in the lesson. They didn't talk long, 15 minutes, maybe 20, the restaurant emptying around them, Mr. Kim discreetly not rushing them despite the hour. But something in the quality of the silence between them had changed by the time Duck-hwan finally rose to leave, folded his exact payment and his extra bill onto the table as always, and paused, jacket half-buttoned, to say, "Thank you for sitting." "Thank you for asking," she said, and meant it more than the polite exchange usually allowed for. She stood at the door after he'd gone, watching his car pull away into the dark, snow starting up again in the orange wash of the street lights, and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that something had crossed over between them that couldn't be walked back. Not romance, not yet, not anything with a clean name, but recognition. The specific, rare recognition of 2 people who had each built a fortress out of necessity, out of loss, out of the practical requirements of survival, and who had just cautiously shown each other a single unguarded window into the rooms behind those walls. She thought, walking home that night through the snow, about her mother's phrase, "Burnt bread still feeds people," and wondered if there was a version of that logic that applied here too, some way that even a relationship built on scraps of conversation and a single dish could still nourish something real, even if it never became the whole meal either of them might once have wanted. She didn't know yet what this was becoming. But she knew, with the same instinctive certainty that had always guided her hands in a kitchen, that it had already stopped being simple, and that she had chosen, quietly, without ceremony, the way she chose most important things, to let it. Spring came slow that year, the thaw dragging its feet through March before finally breaking in April, and with it came a deepening in the small exchanges between them that neither acknowledged out loud but both understood was happening. He started arriving a few minutes early some nights, before the dinner rush properly began, when the dining room was quiet enough for them to talk for 5 or 10 minutes without the pressure of other tables pulling at her attention. He told her, in pieces, more about his mother, that she'd died when he was 17, that the circumstances were tied to the world he'd since inherited, a debt owed to people who didn't forgive easily, though he never went further than the outline of it. He told her about learning, in the years after, to build walls so total that even the people closest to him in his organization understood almost nothing true about him. She told him more too, about Marcus's rough year, about the twins' graduation, about the particular loneliness of being 26 and having built a life so carefully self-sufficient that she sometimes went days without a conversation that wasn't functional, transactional, restaurant business. She didn't dress any of it up. She'd never been someone who dressed things up, and something about his own directness, the way he never offered false comfort, never performed sympathy he didn't feel, made her trust that her own plainness would be received the same way, without judgment, without the need to soften it for his comfort. The threat sharpened in May. It stopped being restless young men nursing beers at a distance and became something more direct. A night when two men and didn't recognize sat down uninvited at a table near Duck-hwan's, close enough to be a statement rather than surveillance, and one of them said something to him in Korean, low and clipped, that made Duck-hwan's whole body go still in a way she'd never seen, a stillness with a different quality than his usual control, something closer to the specific tension of a held weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He said something back, equally low, and after a moment the two men rose and left without ordering anything, but the air in the restaurant stayed charged for the rest of the night, and Anne understood, watching him finish his meal with visibly less appetite than usual, that whatever had just happened represented an escalation neither of them was going to discuss directly. He tried to pull away after that. Not all at once. He still came in, still ordered the same dish, but he grew more distant during their brief exchanges, shorter with his answers, and one night in late May as she cleared his plate he said without looking at her, "It would be better if you forgot what I have told you. All of it." She set the plate down again deliberately and looked at him until he met her eyes. "I'm not going to do that," she said, quiet but certain, the same certainty she'd used with Marcus the night she found him with people who could have gotten him killed. "You don't get to decide what I carry and don't carry. That's not how it works." He looked at her for a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that she couldn't fully read. Frustration maybe, or a kind of helpless respect, or both, and then he said, "You do not understand what you are agreeing to." "I understand enough," she said. "I grew up around danger too. Different flavor. Same weight." He didn't argue further. But something in his posture that night carried a new heaviness, and she understood, walking home later, that she had just refused him a mercy he'd been trying clumsily to offer her, the mercy of walking away clean, before things got more complicated than a customer and a waitress and a shared history of loss had any business being. She thought about that refusal for a long time that night, turning it over the way she turned over every significant decision, and found she didn't regret it, even though regret would have been the safer, more sensible response. She recognized, with an honesty that cost her something, that she had made her own crack in her own armor to match the one she'd made in his. She had spent 8 years building a life that needed no one, and here she was, refusing to walk away from a dangerous man's warning because some part of her, newer, less practiced but undeniably real, had decided that reaching him and staying reachable to him mattered more than the safety of staying uninvolved. It wasn't a decision she could fully justify with logic. It simply was what it was, the way most of the truest things in her life had simply been what they were, arrived at not through careful planning but through the accumulation of small, honest choices that added up, eventually, into a life. He stopped coming in June. It happened without announcement, without a final conversation that either of them could point to and say this was the end, just an absence that stretched from one Thursday into the next, and then the one after that, until 3 weeks had passed and Anne understood, with the specific dull ache of confirmed suspicion, that whatever had prompted the men's visit in May had made him decide he needed to actually follow through on the distance he'd tried, unsuccessfully, to ask for in words. The last time she'd seen him in late May, the conversation had been restrained in a way that felt charged rather than empty. Both of them aware, she thought looking back, that something was closing even as they spoke, though neither said so directly. He'd asked her, near the end of the meal, whether she had family close by, and she told him about the twins, about Marcus, about the small orbit of people she still called on Sundays even though they no longer needed her the way they once had. He'd listened with the same total attention he always gave her, and at the end, when he rose to leave, he'd paused at the door of the dining room and looked back at her for a moment longer than usual before walking out into the night. No note that time. No folded bill left with any additional weight to it. Just the standard exact payment and then nothing. She told herself, the first week, that it was probably business, that men in his position had unpredictable schedules, that his absence didn't necessarily mean anything beyond ordinary circumstance. By the second week, she'd stopped believing her own reassurances. By the third, she'd started quietly bracing for the possibility that the story, whatever it had actually been, had simply ended the way things ended for people who lived the kind of life he lived. Abruptly, without ceremony, without the courtesy of an explanation. She kept working. That was the thing about her life, the through line that had held steady since she was 18. Whatever broke, whatever ended, the work continued because tables still needed clearing and paychecks still needed earning, and the specific discipline of showing up regardless of what she was carrying inside her had been drilled into her so early and so thoroughly that it no longer registered as effort. She served other tables. She adjusted other dishes for other regulars whose quiet griefs she noticed and tended to without ever naming what she was doing. She went home most nights to an apartment that felt, for the first time in a long while, more empty than merely quiet. She still had the note. 2 words, folded now soft at the creases from repeated handling, kept in the nightstand drawer alongside her mother's photo. She took it out sometimes in the evenings, not out of any expectation that doing so would summon him back, but because it had become, without her quite intending it, a kind of evidence, proof that something real had happened between them, whatever its ultimate shape turned out to be, proof that she hadn't imagined the specific weight of reaching someone that thoroughly guarded. She thought, more than once during those weeks, about the parallel between this and her mother's death, not in scale, not in tragedy, but in structure. The way life sometimes simply closed a door without asking permission, without offering the closure a person might reasonably want, and the only available response was the same one she'd learned at 18, standing in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning. You kept moving. You didn't pretend it didn't hurt, but you didn't let the hurt stop your hands from doing what needed doing. She allowed herself grief in careful, contained doses. A few minutes some nights, sitting at her kitchen table with the note in her hands, letting herself feel the specific loss of something that had never fully had a name. But she didn't let it consume the rest of her life. She couldn't. She'd never been built that way, or rather, she'd built herself that way deliberately, out of necessity, over years of practice. By early July, she had arrived at a kind of clear-eyed acceptance that felt less like peace and more like a decision to keep living regardless of the outcome. She understood that some breaks, in a life, in a heart, in the careful architecture of self-sufficiency she'd spent years constructing, didn't heal back to their original shape. They changed the shape of everything that came after, whether or not the thing that caused the break ever returned. She had let a stranger further into her guarded interior than she'd let anyone in years, and that fact remained true regardless of whether she ever saw him again. The note stayed in the drawer. The recipe stayed unchanged on the menu, quietly, a version Mr. Kim had adopted without fanfare after that first rainy night, cooked now for a regular who no longer came to eat it. Anne kept working, kept living, carrying the shape of what had happened the way she carried everything that mattered, privately, steadily, without asking anyone else to hold it for her. The visit came on a Tuesday in late July, on her one night off, a knock at her apartment door just after 9 that made her pulse spike before she'd even reached the peephole, some animal instinct recognizing danger before her conscious mind caught up. It wasn't Duck-hwan. It was one of the men she'd seen watching him months earlier, younger, restless energy replaced now with something more controlled, more deliberate, and he didn't come inside, didn't threaten her outright, just stood in the hallway and studied her for a long moment before saying, in careful, accented English, "You have not seen him. He has not told you where he is." It wasn't quite a question. "No," she said honestly, her voice steadier than she felt. The man studied her a moment longer and then, unexpectedly, held out a folded slip of paper. "He asked that this be given to you. If you were still here. If you had not moved on." She took it with hands she kept deliberately still, and the man left without another word, footsteps receding down the stairwell, and she stood in her doorway for a long moment before she could bring herself to unfold the paper. An address. And beneath it, in the same tight, careful handwriting as the note she still kept in her nightstand drawer. "If you come, you understand what you are choosing. I will not ask again." She sat with it for 2 full days before she went. Not out of hesitation about what she wanted. She knew, with an honesty she'd stopped trying to argue herself out of, exactly what she wanted, but because she understood the gravity of what the address represented, understood that walking through that door meant accepting a level of risk she had spent her whole adult life carefully avoiding. She thought about Marcus, about the twins, about what it would mean for the family she'd rebuilt out of scraps after her mother's death if something happened to her because of a choice she'd made with her eyes open. She thought about her mother too, oddly, about the specific bravery it had taken Denise to keep choosing her children every single exhausted day for 18 years, never once performing the sacrifice, just quietly deciding over and over that some things were worth the cost. She went on a Thursday evening, the same night of the week he'd always come to her. His apartment was smaller than she expected, sparser. A single room with minimal furniture, no photographs, nothing personal visible except a small, worn Buddhist prayer bead bracelet hanging over a lamp, the kind of space that belonged to a man who had never let himself believe permanence was safe to want. He opened the door before she knocked, like he'd been watching for her, and for a moment they simply stood there, the specific weight of weeks of silence sitting between them. "You should not have come," he said, but there was no real conviction in it, more like a formality he felt obligated to voice. "You left the address anyway," she said. He let her in. They sat across from each other at a small table, and he told her, without softening any of it, exactly what she was risking by continuing to know him, that the men watching him represented a faction within his organization actively working against him, that his position was precarious in ways he'd never fully explained to her, that anyone close to him became, by extension, a target, a piece of leverage. He told her he had stayed away for 6 weeks specifically because he'd hoped the distance would let her return to the life she'd had before him, safe, uncomplicated, entirely her own. "It didn't work," he said, quiet, almost an admission of failure. "The crack you made. It has not closed." "Mine hasn't either," she said, and meant it fully, the months of carrying his silence around like an unfinished conversation, the note worn soft in her nightstand, the specific hollowness of an apartment that had felt, since June, like it was missing something she couldn't fully name until she was sitting across from him again. They talked for hours that night, later than she'd talked to anyone in years, both of them laying out the full unvarnished shape of what continuing would mean. The risk, the secrecy it would require, the fact that there was no guarantee of safety or resolution on either side. Neither of them pretended otherwise. Neither of them offered false comfort. And at the end of it, sitting in the quiet of his sparse apartment with the city noise filtering faintly through the window, they arrived together at the same decision they'd each apparently already made separately weeks earlier without saying so out loud. They would continue. Not because it was safe. Not because it was simple. But because the alternative, the clean, sensible ending, had already proven, over 6 silent weeks, to be a kind of loss neither of them was willing to keep choosing. The summer that followed unfolded in careful, secret pieces. Meetings arranged with the same precision Duck-hwan brought to everything else in his life, never the same location twice in a row, never predictable enough to be tracked. And understood the danger hadn't lessened. If anything, the men watching him grew more persistent as the season wore on, and there were nights she went home from a meeting with her pulse still elevated hours later, adrenaline slow to fade. But she didn't regret the choice, not once, not even on the harder nights. They talked more than they had before, deeper now, without the restraint of a public dining room limiting what either of them could safely say. He told her, eventually, the fuller shape of what had happened to his mother, not every detail, some things clearly still too raw even now to hand over whole, but enough that and understood the specific architecture of the grief that had lived in him for 2 decades, understood why a plate of galbi-jim on a rainy Tuesday had been able to crack something open that 20 years of careful control had kept sealed. She told him, in turn, about the exact texture of the night her mother died, the details she'd never told anyone else, not even Marcus. The smell of the hospital hallway, the specific way the doctor had said irreversible like it cost him nothing, the way she'd gone home afterward and made dinner for her siblings anyway because someone had to, because that was simply what the situation required of her. There was no false hope offered on either side, no sudden resolution to the danger that continued to shadow both their lives. The men watching him didn't disappear. The risk didn't evaporate because 2 people had decided it was worth carrying. But something had settled between them anyway, a kind of earned steadiness that didn't depend on the danger resolving to feel real. In August, on a warm evening with the windows open and the city sounds drifting up soft from the street below, and cooked the galbi-jim for him in his own kitchen. The first time she'd cooked there, the first time she understood he'd let anyone cook in a kitchen that was actually his in 20 years. She worked slowly, the way her mother had taught her without ever calling it teaching, browning the short ribs first, building the braise layer by layer, adding the smoked paprika and the brown sugar at exactly the moments her hands had learned to know, and he sat at the small table and watched her the whole time with an attention that had nothing left of the guarded blankness he'd worn the first night she served him, months and a lifetime ago. When she set the finished plate in front of him this time, there was no audience, no crowded dining room to witness the moment privately from a professional distance. Just the 2 of them in his kitchen, the window open to the sound of the city, and when his chopsticks paused this time, briefly, the pause smaller now, softer, more like recognition than rupture, she didn't have to watch from across the room. She was close enough to reach across the table and set her hand over his, and he let her, his fingers turning slowly to close around hers, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because nothing needed saying that the food and the silence and the warmth of 2 hands finally, deliberately, choosing to touch hadn't already said. He who had spent 20 years believing trust was the mechanism by which people lost everything remained, in this small kitchen, open in a way he had let almost no one witness. She who had spent 8 years building a life that required nothing from anyone had allowed herself, finally, to need another person's presence, to want it, to choose it even knowing the cost. Neither of them pretended the future was settled. The danger remained real, the secrecy would likely need to continue, and there was no guarantee, none offered, none expected, that this would end anywhere safe or simple. But sitting there with her hand in his, the smell of the braise still warm in the small kitchen, the city breathing quietly outside the open window, and understood that some things were worth choosing precisely because they weren't safe or simple, the way her mother had chosen, every exhausted day for 18 years, to keep loving her children fully even when the cost of that love asked everything of her. They ate together, slowly, the way people eat when a meal is less about hunger than about the specific privilege of sharing a table with someone who has finally, fully, let you see them. And when the plate was empty and the night had gone fully dark outside the window, they stayed at the table a while longer, hands still loosely joined, neither of them in any hurry to be anywhere else. Two people who had each survived their own versions of being left alone too young, who had built their separate fortresses out of necessity, and who had decided, deliberately and with eyes open, that remaining reachable to each other was worth whatever it ultimately cost.